and communicate rather clearly. Does that not touch on what you're trying to say? Oh, no. Well, I mean, I would assume not. It seems to me that what I was trying to say at the beginning is that that is also the very fundamental difference between the two periods, the two, in Gunn's sense, the state of that inner structure, deep in the heart of it all, the tectonic structure, is totally different. That we no longer believe that, revolutions actually get you anywhere, that they really change anything, that that's how you restructure society by force, that there are actually in a rather more genuinely Marxist kind of way perhaps believe that there are forces which are not actually containable, which have their own momentum, which are generated by forms of technology that grow. We use them in rather randomly selected ways, and where we go is something that actually, as I said, has a kind of probability about it, but certainly not a deterministic certainty. And that is the most important difference between then and now. So, I mean, to suggest having a revolution in, the Parc La Villette, or whatever that's a metaphor for, is a revolutionary situation in the 1920s sense seems to me to be absolutely, it's mixing oil and water. I mean, I was almost going to say it's to miss the fundamental point, but I didn't want to sound offensive. Do you see what I mean? It's at that level that the difference is utterly distinct. Yes, I mean, that's true. But on the other hand, I just wanted in this case to take something which was, in a rather simple way, raise the subject rather than, I wouldn't want to press it too far, and I certainly wouldn't want to embarrass Shumi by pressing it too far. And to make sure I chose something, that was neutral in relation to perhaps this side of the Atlantic. I mean, I can only say I this afternoon actually got a copy of the catalogue of this preliminary exhibition in New York. And if you can understand what Mark Wigley is saying about how all that stuff relates to constructivism, I can't. I was a bit tired and I tried to read it rather fast, but I've heard him speak. And I mean, this is in a way why I stress this, because it seems to me you only understand this stuff, you only use it if you actually in detail look at what they were saying about how you design things. That the level of generality of all that stuff is, it's kind of too clever for me, actually. What do I do? You mean with my spare time to remain sane? Well, if you want to know, I mean, it's not a kind of joke question in a way. I live in a medieval environment in a town called Cambridge. And the extraordinary thing about that place is that, and I remember we used to feel this as undergraduates, buzzing behind these medieval walls, which are utterly fixed and are a kind of utter, the supreme statement of continuity of culture and so on, were the most advanced developments going on. And that somehow the one kind of helped with the other. I mean, to be a slightly different anecdotal thing, when I was a graduate student doing my research, I was a member of a college which built a new building. And it was done by actually Ralph Erskine, but there were some local architects who were the executive architects who were fairly dim kind of local architects. And the head of this college was an absolutely brilliant Nobel Prize winner theoretical physicist. And I remember that after the opening of this college building, we went back to his house, and this architect took me aside behind the piano, and he said, I mean, this was about the most typical suburban house you could imagine, you know. Cozy wife, jolly nice food, totally nondescript furniture, some rather nice solid stuff. And this man said to me, how can it be that a man who spends his time on the frontiers of South lives in this place? And I remember at the time thinking, and I mean it's absolutely apropos to what you're saying, you know, that he only keeps saying, if he spends his days, as this man was, absolutely beyond any frontiers of our normal experience, in terms of time, scale, space, and everything else. The only thing that saves you, I'm sure, in that situation, and one knows it only in a limited degree in a field like ours, is the fact that you walk out of the door and you're a normal human being in a real scale, and you feel things, and you know, things are cozy and normal. You know, there's other people argue that architecture doesn't have that particular function and so on, or it may be such a crisis in the psychology it can't give. But that struck me at the time as a very dumb observation by a chap who's actually a fairly dumb architect. He fancied himself because he'd been executing this building by a much better architect. But, you know, it took me aback because I knew exactly why he had, and I had seen it before with other people in Cambridge in whose houses I'd lived, of a similar kind. Utterly cozy, comfy, ordinary domesticity. And it seems to me, I mean, certainly it's jolly nice in Cambridge to go out and feel the sunlight on the stone, and, you know, I don't expect you to have these experiences here. I've learned that there's no stone underneath any of what looks like stone at all. But, you know, it's something which I'm sure you can't understand here, because, I mean, I used to say these things in jest, but certainly in Europe, maybe it's the thing that holds us back, but it's also one of the things that, certainly in a place like this, is the balancing factor. I mean, do you find it something that you feel you need? Do you think that's the explanation for all these classical houses I see down the freeways? Maybe it is. Reference to some stable culture and so on. Well, obviously there are two completely separate things. One is the capitalist city and one is what they're doing. And I mean, it seems to me, I'm no particular authority on this, you all have perhaps more intelligent observations, that a lot of what has happened is very much what they saw was happening, which is dispersal. In this eternal phrase, distance is measured by time. 5 minutes to a place, rather you talk about it being, you know, half an hour there instead of it being 3 kilometers or something. And certainly that sort of dispersal is taking place even on the little island where I live. It's taking place all over Europe, and I mean, you've had it here for years. It's one of the problems in Britain, to be very sort of banal about it. The railway system is now so much better in the last even 3 or 4 years that it's extended the commuter area enormously, and you've got major shifts going on in the journey to work pattern and so on. Simply because, I mean, the railways now come to Cambridge in an hour. A few years ago it was an hour and a half, and that's a magic difference in terms of house prices and in terms of how people use their time. But, I mean, the Soviet situation is in a way much more interesting because, well, at a certain level it's more interesting because it's the result of a conscious planning, an attempt to understand theoretically and actually do something. And what they have tried to do is to see their whole settlement system increasingly as one system. And in the early 70s, they formulated something called the General Scheme of Settlement, if you like, overall scheme of settlement for the Soviet Union, which operates regionally and sub-regionally on the principle that the fact that you choose to live in a village or that you choose to live in a larger town does not determine your standard of living, that you have certain time accessibilities to key facilities, that nobody is more than half an hour away from a cinema, or nobody is more than 10 minutes away from a primary school or something. Whatever is the medium, transport medium through which they achieve that half hour, which of course affects the actual distance. And so what they're trying to produce is something, they have a theory they call the group theory of settlement at the regional scale, whereby settlements are planned as networks within a region or sub-region on that basis, on a series of graphs of time accessibility. And that's the underlying theory behind what they're moving towards now. I mean, there's a crisis in architecture at the moment, but all that is basically the planning staff, which is obviously set up by major infrastructure investments and so on, is chugging along and is certainly doing a great deal to achieve those intentions of raising standard of living of people who either work on the land or choose to live outside a city or in a middle-sized city rather than a larger one within a planned region. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff of this urbanist was, as I hinted before in saying constructivists had an important effect on planning, was very much taken on board. They were the ones that set up the model through this very heated debate around their projects, which I didn't go into the debate at all. Who, when the city was seen by city planners in the Soviet Union as this kind of blob thing, which you may slightly restructure, but fundamentally it's still a blob, and were building those all over the Soviet Union. They said, no, consider the impact of transportation, the impact of communications, consider what is your real social aspiration. That is the proper systems model that you should be working within. And they had a dramatic effect on the way things were thought about. There was then the 30s, all kinds of panics, the threat of war, destruction, and so on. And to a large extent, it's only really in the 60s leading up to this general schema and since that they've actually been able to settle down and, do some restructuring. They've been, things have been bashed around by the Germans and so on. And they had to start all over again. So the impact of these people, that's one of the things I think is very interesting about them, in terms of planning thought, was enormous. There's no doubt about that. You read that debate that's in one of this book that Margaret referred to about city planning, is centrally about that. And I mean, it's extraordinary. They completely changed the scale and scope of debate.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And you can come up and ask more informal questions afterwards if you'd like.
If one is observant, some movement phenomenon may be observed even within this quite static environment. Here, reflection and transparency play with your perception of the escalator. And here, some mylar balloons blow in the wind, catching fleeting moments of light. Looking around town for other pedestrian-perceived four-dimensional phenomenon, we find fences. Fences provide the pedestrian with a variety of interesting sights, including variations of strobographic, here, notice the strobographic effect at the corner of the fence. And here, with a backlit chain-link fence, we may observe the moire effect. Reflection is an engaging phenomenon at all speeds, and is one of the most commonly observed as a pedestrian. Notice how these reflective columns interact with their surroundings, capturing segments of the scene and putting them together. This is also interesting from a stationary point of view. I call this four-dimensional perspective. Reflection also manifests in small ways, such as on these light fixtures. Here, the reflections on the car windshields do a wonderful dance with the fence and the lights. Notice how the red reflection slides down the windshields of the cars. Frames. The cracks on the sidewalk moving by. An opening through a building. Serial elements, such as the structure of a power station. These are all frames. In the developing areas of a city, the pedestrian may observe hide and seek on a level of scale. Tall office buildings emerge, then disappear from view behind closer and lower residential structures. The Crocker Center, downtown, plays a sort of hide-and-seek with itself as the thin edge of one side of the tower moves back, revealing another side and yet another tower. Sometimes design elements present an image of movement, such as this statue of 3 running women in front of, all places, the YMCA. But there's nothing like some naked women running in front of the life cycles to inspire more movement in the cyclists. Other aspects of movement presented to the pedestrian are building elements that move. These may be used or observed elements. Elevators and escalators are elements that often offer exciting experiences of space-time phenomenon. Other moving elements are only to be observed. Some of these are water, unique surface treatments, such as this sequined building or this cracking building, both of which are on Melrose. The most common, effective, and, I must add, banal use of moving elements in architecture is in advertising. The West Side Pavilion, for all of its faults and criticisms, is a project that seems to address the idea of movement. It is a space that is interesting, exciting, and fun to move through. The use of reflective surfaces, serial elements, and moving elements creates a stage on which we may observe and enjoy the experience of movement.
It isn't beautiful. Who do you think lives there? Satisfaction.
I'm going to give you a clear vista of the edge of the civilized world.